Mother is calling.
Te ves muy churro.
Gracias. Dime algo. ¿Es verdad que naciste en una finca cafetera?
Sí, claro. Nací en una finca cafetera en el departamento del Tolima, en una hacienda que se llamaba Llano Hondo.
Ok. Durante mi niñez, ¿cuántas veces al día bebías café?
Uh, bueno, pues bastante, 3, 4, muchas tazas de café las tomaba.
Siempre me acuerdo que bebías tinto de un florero.
Sí, sí. Así que te quiero mucho.
Te quiero. Chao.
Chao.
When you think of Colombia, you may think of coffee. But did you know that coffee isn't native to Colombia, or Brazil, or Java for that matter? Coffee comes from Ethiopia. During the 15th century, Sufi mystic sects in nearby Yemen adopted the drink as a religious elixir for nighttime ceremonies. Kawa, as it was called, helped its drinkers better focus on God. Through these Sufi practices, coffee diffused north into the Muslim world. In the 16th century, Yemeni students at the Al-Azhar Islamic University brought coffee to Cairo, drinking it socially rather than religiously. Coffee then traveled to Istanbul in 1554, 40 years after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. Coffee houses formed, creating social nexuses where men of all classes sat at long tables in order of arrival rather than rank. These novel third places introduced an egalitarian social dynamic to the imperial capital. In the 17th century, European writers, like Englishman Sir Henry Blount, obscured coffee's Muslim association by claiming it emerged from the ancient Greeks. Western origin stories like this aided coffee's proliferation throughout Christian Europe, and European laborers began drinking coffee at work. As Ethiopia was the main source of coffee for 200 years, growing international demand soon outstripped its supply. Furthermore, the Ottomans, who controlled major coffee trade routes into Europe, banned coffee exports outside the empire in 1707. European imperial powers responded by cultivating their own coffee in overseas colonies. The Dutch in Java, Sumatra, and Suriname, the French in Bourbon, Réunion, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and the British in India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Slave labor was critical to the success of this colonial form of resource extraction. The amount of coffee imported into Europe from the Americas matched that of Asia by the 1750s. However, by the early 19th century, the US and Europe refused to do business with the newly independent nation of Haiti, refocusing Western attention to Asian coffee sources. In 1869, an outbreak of Hemilia vastatrix, leaf rust, obliterated British coffee plantations in Ceylon, pushing tea to the forefront of British consumer culture. This leaf rust also swept across the rest of Asia, Africa, and even the Pacific. By World War I, the Americas emerged as the world's primary source of coffee. This brings us to Colombia, where Jesuit missionaries first planted coffee seeds during Spanish colonization. By the early 20th century, there was a small local finca, or coffee farm, in the Colombian Andes called Llano Hondo. This farm was owned by Mercedes y Modesto Ibáñez, my great-grandparents.
Imagínate, cierra los ojos, imagínate que está en la mitad de un terreno muy grande, vas a oír el sonido de los pájaros, el viento que mueve las hojas de los árboles y bueno, el aroma de las flores también. Entonces me trae muy bonitos recuerdos porque allí fue donde nací. También por las noches nos sentábamos a ver las estrellas porque el firmamento era tan amplio y sin polución ni nada de esto que tú podías ver las estrellas. Y caminábamos por toda la área cafetera para ver cuándo era que estaba el café, que se demoraba bastante, ¿no? No era en un año, 2 años, se demoraba bastante. Aprendí mucho de eso.
Veo que nuestra familia tiene una historia verdadera con el café. Yo bebo café, tú bebías café, mi abuela bebía su tinto cada día, mi abuelo era ingeniero cafetero y mis bisabuelos tenían una finca cafetera. Es nuestra herencia.
Sí.
Pero el café es últimamente una herencia colonial, como el cristianismo, como el idioma que estoy hablando, como la nación de Colombia en sí misma. There is a purposeful obfuscation that takes place in the formation of nationalist identity. It is a rewriting of time, a new birth that obscures its conception. My Spanish ancestors colonized the Andes and committed genocide against my indigenous ancestors, the Pijao. Spain, and then the independent settler colonial state of Colombia, commodified the land and sold plots to farmers, like my ancestors, to cultivate crops for sale in a capitalist market. As Colombia's coffee production doubled in the early 20th century, my great-grandmother Mercedes inherited the Llano Hondo coffee farm from her parents, who inherited it from their parents, and so on. Her daughter, my grandmother, Fidelina, also went on to inherit Llano Hondo, but eventually sold it after my grandfather Jorge Roman's sudden death in 1959. The Pijao language was declared extinct that same decade, but a few words survive, thanks to some linguists in the 1940s. I sent these words to my mother, and she recognized one.
Golupa.
It describes an Andean fruit with a tough citrus-like skin, filled with jelly-coated seeds. The golupa, or la granadilla in Spanish, has always been my favorite fruit.